Hello, my absent and quarantined students. I just want to give you a quick run through of what we covered in finishing up the Topic 10 overview today in class. So I'll just go over the answers that we came up with you so that you have them so you can prepare yourself for the test tomorrow. If you are in quarantine tomorrow, during the normal class time, you will need to log on and take the test. Okay, so the first one that we hadn't yet gotten to was about the Tet Offensive and why it's a turning point. This is when the war starts to look unwinnable. The military seemed to be misrepresenting what was going on the ground, and it started to look more and more like the war was going to be a long, hard slog that most people weren't really willing to get into. And so the government starts looking for a peace agreement at that point. After Vietnam, remember, after the war, Vietnam will become all one communist nation. Now, this will happen a couple years after the U.S. withdrawal. The Civil War resumes. North invades the South, overtakes Saigon, and reunites it as a single communist country at that point. These we covered. All right, so Johnson's Great Society programs, remember, are just going to be gutted by spending on the Vietnam War. Some of them are still with us today, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and that sort of thing, but a lot of the anti-poverty programs, just as Martin Luther King had feared, became underfunded and ineffective. In the election of 1968, for one thing, Johnson is going to surprise everybody by announcing that he will not run for re-election. This is after the Tet Offensive. He's going to instead focus on trying to come to a peace agreement with Vietnam. Nixon will also, who's running for the Republican side, will claim he has some sort of plan to get us out of Vietnam. It kind of comes to be known as sort of a secret plan because he says he can't tell you. The secret might have been that he didn't have a plan. But regardless, both sides are really focusing on like how to get out of the war as a political issue. In 72, then Nixon is running for re-election, and once again he has to focus on ending the war in Vietnam. And so he does hammer out a peace agreement with North Vietnam before the election of 72, and he wins pretty handedly, by a large margin in 1972. That plan will then fall apart when North Vietnam walks away from it, but Nixon will resume bombing of North Vietnam, bring them back to the table, and then eventually we get the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. One of the big impacts of the Vietnam War is how it affects the way U.S. handles future conflicts. We become much more cautious about using the military overseas, particularly if we do not have a clear goal. Throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when the U.S. does get involved overseas, it's usually for a limited goal and one with a very clear exit strategy. Now, a lot of this will change after September 11th, 2001. The AUMF that we're under now gives much broader power. There isn't really a clear end goal to the war on terror. But prior to that, between the Vietnam War and September 11th, we always tried to make our military engagements limited with a clear exit strategy for fear of getting stuck in another Vietnam where we couldn't figure out a way to get out of it. These two questions deal with the president's power. At the beginning of the war, Johnson is issued the Gulf of Tonkin resolution by Congress, where they essentially hand over war-making powers to him, gave the president the power to use the military in Vietnam essentially however he wanted. Basically, it was a blank check. Spend what you want, use what you need, whatever, to accomplish our goals in Vietnam. And this will be used, much like the AUMF is today, this will be used to justify expanding the war both under Johnson and Nixon, into Laos and Cambodia and the more bombing and all that other stuff. Really part of that trend of Congress handing more and more power over to the president that we see throughout much of the 20th century. After the war, Congress tries to claw some of this back with the War Powers Act, which is going to put some limits back on the president's war-making power, namely that if the president commits U.S. troops in another country, he has to inform Congress within 48 hours, and Congress has to approve it. And if they don't, he has, I want to say it's like 60 days to get troops out of there. So we have never declared war since World War II, but Congress has had to sort of give approval to things like the war in Iraq and others for a certain amount of time. The draft during the war, this is takes a couple of steps to get to, but why is it considered unfair? Poor and working class men were more likely to be drafted. And this is because in the 60s, a lot of people did not go to college, not nearly as many as go to college today. So a lot of the people, a lot of the people who were in college were upper middle or wealthier class, and so they were exempted. If you were in college, you had an exemption, and certain jobs were considered exempt from it as well, and that tended to favor the wealthier people as not as getting an exemption from being drafted. And then lastly, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, and that is because of the Vietnam War. You could be drafted at age 18, but in most states in America at the time, you had to be 21 to vote. And there's definitely something incongruous with that. That if you're old enough to, handle an M16 in the jungles of Southeast Asia, you probably ought to be able to handle a ballot at your local polling place. And then, of course, the optics of, you could be required to fight and die for your country somewhere else in the world, but you couldn't choose the leaders who sent you off to war. So the 26th Amendment won't be passed until after the Vietnam War, but it is because of the Vietnam War that the voting age has been lowered to 18 in all states. All right. The first of the extended response questions, I ask you for 4 reasons some Americans opposed the Vietnam War. You saw a lot of this with lesson 3. And really, last Thursday, when we looked at those documents, you got a lot of different reasons that people were part of the anti-war movement. These are some of them that we brainstormed during class today. The war would drag on and on. It would be almost like a never-ending war that didn't seem to have an exit. Some people opposed the war, as John Kerry had said, Vietnam is not really a threat to the United States. What happens in Vietnam doesn't affect American freedoms. It costs a lot of money. It also costs a lot of lives. 58,202 Americans estimated to have died in this war. 1 to 2 million Vietnamese civilians will die in this war. Martin Luther King opposed it because of the loss of life, both American and Vietnamese. The people saw the death on TV. This is the most televised war in U.S. history. The military will not give this level of access to the media in any war since then. And you could see in living color the horrors of war, and many people started to question whether it was worth what they were seeing happening. Others argued Vietnam is a civil war within its own borders. It is none of our business. From the North Vietnamese perspective, it's a war for independence. From the U.S. perspective, it's a war of containment. But for a lot of people, especially in Vietnam, this is part of a larger civil war within there. And many Americans said it's not our problem to get involved in. The bombing, killing many civilians, the My Lai massacre, both reasons for us to say we need to get out of there. We're doing bad things there. The Pentagon Papers revealing that the government had misled us also contributed to this. And then, King also made the argument that we see with like World War II and World War I, that particularly for African American soldiers to be fighting in another country for freedoms that you cannot enjoy in your own country kind of doesn't make sense. There are many others you could use. Just make sure you explain how it is related to the Vietnam War, and most of these it's pretty obvious, but just make sure it's clear what that reasoning was that people oppose the war, and you only need 4. So pick 4 that you can remember. And then lastly, this second extended response question, I asked for 4 long-term political, economic, and or social effects of the Vietnam War in the United States. Just look at lesson 4 that we did on Monday. And I said and or, it's not like you need one of each. Just give me 4 effects and make sure it is clear how those things are related to the Vietnam War. So the increased debt and deficit, the War Powers Act, which we talked about earlier, and the 26th Amendment we also talked about earlier, both can be seen as long-term effects of the war. That lack of trust in the government that many Americans had as a result of those aforementioned things like the Pentagon Papers and so forth. Our caution about using troops overseas, like I said, until September 11th, we will become much more cautious about how we use our military and for how long. The 1970s will see an economic crisis and inflation that is attributable to many different facets, but Vietnam is one of them. 58,220 Americans died in this. That obviously has a long-term impact. And there are many other things that you could mention as far as how those things changed America. Just make sure in the 4 that you choose, you make it obvious. If you tell me what the 26th Amendment did, make sure you tie it to the Vietnam War, that it was they lowered the voting age because the men in Vietnam could be drafted at age 18 yet could not vote at home. Okay, so tomorrow what you're going to want to do is log on at the time of your class, and the test will be open for you to take then. Good luck.